I live in Columbus, Ohio, and I used to visit a big park just outside the city once or twice a month to hike the trails. Notice I said, used to. I wasn't an avid hiker necessarily, but I preferred the wooded trails to concrete, and it was nice to get away from the city and out of the heat. The park was large and in a rural area, so I would see a good amount of wildlife on my hikes, including a few foxes and even a coyote once. One Sunday afternoon in October, I went out for my usual hike. The park was typically fairly busy, but I live in a huge football city, and there was a big rivalry game that day, so it was more deserted than normal. It was a little bit chilly, but good weather for hiking, so I was wearing running tights and a long-sleeved running shirt, zipped up over a tank top. I didn't have a bag with me, but just had my keys and phone zipped in my jacket pockets. I don't always listen to music when I hike, but I did that day, although the volume wasn't up very loud since it's so quiet out there. Aside from being deserted, the hike was pretty normal at first. The park is beautiful in a very primeval way. The forest was old growth, very dense, and has a heavy feeling to it. I chose a loop that was only 5 miles, but pretty steep. It runs alongside a deep gorge and can get rocky at times. You can almost always hear water running from the river at the bottom of the gorge. The first 2 miles were a very gradual and the easiest part of the loop. After that point, I was pretty zoned out, just daydreaming while watching the uneven terrain. Out of nowhere, I saw something huge streak past me, off to my right, up in the woods. I stopped walking and stared into the woods, shocked. Whatever it had been, it was massive. But beyond that, I had no idea what it could be. The woods were so thick in this spot that despite being a sunny day, it was really hard to see far. I knew there were animals in the woods, of course, but it had been too big to be a deer and too fast to be a bear. I didn't think it was a person, but I couldn't be sure. I pulled my headphones out, but couldn't hear anything except for the rushing water and some birds. It was too early in the fall for many leaves to have fallen, so something walking or running wouldn't make that much noise anyway. After standing motionless and watching for another minute or so, I didn't see or hear anything else, so I shrugged and just kept going. For a while, I kept an eye on the woods as I was hiking, but after another 5 minutes, I moved on and stopped thinking about it. I assumed it was just a really big deer or some other forest animal. I had reached the steeper, narrower part of the hike now and had to focus more on the ground. I moved along slowly for a while, not watching the woods at all. 10 minutes into this hike, I thought I heard or felt something in the woods again. It wasn't anything specific this time, just that unnerving feeling that you aren't alone. Again, I waited a minute, but not seeing or hearing anything, I just kept walking. Just as I had decided that it was nothing, I caught another blur of motion out of the corner of my eye. This time it was moving towards me, and fast. I jerked backward out of reflex and caught my right foot on a raised tree branch. I tripped and fell and somersaulted down the hill. The world whirled by for a second until my head collided with something hard and I felt pain right before losing consciousness. I woke up slowly and groggily. It took me a minute to get my bearings. I could see a lot of trees and sky, and it all came back to me. I sat up way too quickly. My head throbbed and everything ached. I felt my head and it came back sticky with blood. I could see some scrapes and a bruise or two forming on my legs and arms. Once my head cleared, I remembered the blur that had come at me, and I looked around for it. I had fallen about 15 feet down the hill, but luckily not all the way to the river. I didn't see anything human or animal around. I glanced at my watch to see how much time had passed. I thought it had been around 2:30 the last time I had checked. Slowly, I got up and checked my clothes. In that minute, I noticed it was 3:30. Had 45 minutes gone past? At that same time, I noticed 2 other very concerning things. One was my phone and keys were laying on the ground near me, but the entire time I was hiking, they had been zipped in my pockets. There was no way my jacket had become unzipped from falling. Second thing was, there was a really weird mark on my right wrist. It was a perfect circle, like a rug burn, or a mark from a restraint, like handcuffs. The bruises and scrapes all made sense from the fall, but there was nothing that could explain that mark on my wrist. With my heart pounding and hands shaking, I picked up my keys and phone and stared at them. I put the keys back in my pocket. Before I put the phone back, I entered my code and unlocked it to check for messages. The camera app was open, which was weird. In the bottom were the thumbnails for the camera roll. Not recognizing the first one, I opened it. It was a picture of me, laying in the woods, taken from someone standing above. I barely remember walking back out of the woods. I'm sure I ran. To this day, I have no idea what the blur was, and if it was connected to whomever, or whatever, took my picture. Regardless, I don't go back to that park anymore or hike alone. I study bats for a living, and 3 years ago, I was doing some nighttime surveys in Mammoth Cave in Kentucky. I know it might sound weird, but this cave is full of different bat species, and researchers love it because it's huge and has a lot of unique wildlife. I really like my job. Bats are amazing. They're like little flying fossils. Also, I feel a deep connection with them, which a lot of people tell me is weird, but it's who I am, and I like it. And anyway, you can't beat the peace and quiet in the cave at night. It's calm but creepy at the same time, which suits me just fine. It was winter, which is an important time for counting bats. The evening started off as usual. It was a really cold day, and it got very dark as I went into the cave with only my flashlight. Inside the cave, the air was wet and cold compared to the dry winter cold outside. The rocks were freezing and sharp, making it hard to walk. It felt like I had to dance around them. Once you get used to the cave, every step or breath feels like you've heard or felt it before, like a repeating echo. It can feel pretty lonely, but kind of nice too. My job wasn't all that exciting. I mainly just looked for a group of bats that were hibernating, counted them, and sometimes checked out a bat or two to see if they were sick. After I was done with a group, I was packing up my stuff when I heard this weird clicking noise bouncing around the cave. It definitely wasn't a bat. I know how bats sound, but this was weird and creeped me out. Normally, I hear a few animals who somehow end up in the cave, but this was something else. I can't quite put it into words, but it gave me a chill that ran up my back. Felt a creepiness, like you're not alone. At first, I thought maybe a hiker got lost, but it's improbable since this cave's a bit out of the way. I also noticed a certain rhythm to the sounds, like something's doing it on purpose, watching or waiting. But well, it's just a cave. Weird stuff tends to happen when you're deep underwater in the middle of the night. Using my headlamp, I explored further into the cave. As I passed the usual big rocks and huge stalagmites, I felt a bit uncomfortable. All I could hear were bats and the sound of water dripping, which was like a steady beat. Suddenly, a clicking noise interrupted, jarring the rhythm like a misplaced note in a melody. I carefully walked deeper into the cave till I got to a massive space where I couldn't see the walls or the ceiling, just loads of bats hanging up there in the dark. This was the creature's home, but I didn't realize that at the time. Everything was super quiet, and all I could really hear was my heart beating and the sound of water drops hitting something, probably an underground pool, somewhere further in. I was shining my flashlight around the cave, searching for what caused the clicking sound. Suddenly, a bat flew down, breaking the quiet. After my heart calmed down, I saw something, a weird shadow that didn't look like the other rocks and formations. I stared hard into the dark, holding my breath while I tried to figure out what it was. There was a shadowy figure at the edge of the light. Its shape was sort of familiar but also off, like a scary imitation of someone. The figure moved. No, actually, it crawled. And not slowly, but super fast. Then it suddenly hit me. This wasn't just about mixing up different kinds of wildlife. Something was seriously off. This was supposed to be my story about the night, the bats and their hidden lives. I didn't realize then, but it was the start of something I'd always remember. I was stuck in place when I heard the clicking noises come around again. They seemed closer this time, like they were in my head. There was this shadow that looked kinda like a person, but deformed. It was pretty big, about 5.5 feet if it stood up straight, but it stayed crawling around the rocks like it was at home. It moved weirdly, fast and careful at the same time. It was dark, but the lantern's light showed it had pale, thin skin. It sort of looked like a human, but more worn out, just like the cave around us. I tried not to shake while holding the light, and then I noticed it had 2 huge black eyes that looked directly at me. It had no nose, no unique features, only a wide open mouth. It was all twisted, having weird and unexpected angles. I was scared to death when it made that clicking sound again, this time louder, bouncing off the cave walls. It made me think of those scary stories from when I was a kid, when the wind would blow and make creepy sounds down the narrow alleyways. It was dead quiet down here, which made the chirping sound really weird. I wanted to get out of there, but I was too scared to move. I knew at that point I should go. It didn't seem worth it to stay. It just didn't feel right. It felt like we were unwelcome, like we were messing things up. Somehow, I pulled myself together enough to stop shivering, getting up from the rock wall. Threw my stuff in my backpack as quickly as I could, didn't have time to pack neatly. Felt like each passing second was something I didn't have the luxury to waste. I was packing in a hurry and kept a close eye on the scary figure the whole time. I noticed the cave was suddenly very quiet. When I got to the entrance of the cave, I risked a look back. The monster had disappeared into the dark and stopped making that clicking noise. The only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat, loud and clear in the silent darkness I once found comforting. In my Jeep, I started wondering, was it a lost caver who changed due to staying underground too long, or some unknown cave animal? Nothing added up. Even with all the knowledge science offers, I couldn't find any clear answers to calm my confusion. From that day on, Mammoth Cave, where I usually go for research and peace, started feeling different. Every time I think about what happened, I get the shivers. I can't seem to forget that night. It just keeps coming back to me. It's crazy how one event can just turn your world upside down. The cave, strangely, hasn't changed at all, but holds something that I can't fully understand. I've been looking into bats, exploring all kinds of weird and dangerous places, but this was unusual. The thing they started calling the crawler was like something from old legends, mysterious creatures that lived in the dark. As a scientist, I naturally want to figure stuff out, especially if it's a mystery. But honestly, the idea of coming face to face with something creepy and unknown scares me. It's pretty weird. The cave is just like it was with bats, water dripping from those pointy rocks, the creepy silence, and especially the feeling that some creature lives there. Nobody knows what it is, but it's definitely there. My experience there is what got me into stuff between science and spooky stories, or what's real and what's just scary dreams. From 2010 through 2015, I was living out of a van. I would travel all over the country, staying in Walmart parking lots, my friends' driveways, campsites, and oftentimes just down some path into the woods that was wide enough to fit my vehicle. I have countless wild adventure stories from that 5-year period, but I'll share with you the one that really left a mark, both physically and mentally. For the last few years of my adventures, I had stuck to the east coast of the United States, slowly making my way north to New Hampshire and Maine in the warmer months, and then heading slowly south as the winter approached to avoid the blistering cold of the northern states of the eastern U.S. I had made friends and contacts from Florida to Maine and would stop for a week or two at certain locations to work, make some travel money, and visit with people I knew along the way. In 2014, while heading north, I had decided to pass through New Jersey. That year I met and made friends while camping with some New Jersey people known as Pineys. They call themselves that because they live in a little-known but fairly vast forest in the southern half of the state known as the Pine Barrens. These good folks took an instant liking to me and had spent almost a week living at my campsite with me at one point. They worked as roofers during the day. They were super friendly, fiercely loyal, and hardworking, and we got to know each other pretty well. So in 2015, as I was headed south for Central Florida, I made sure to swing by New Jersey again to hang out with them and make a little cash roofing with them. We spent 6 12-hour days roofing together and camped out in my van at my friend's small blueberry farm in the Pine Barrens. On the 7th day, I decided that after hearing endless tales about the wonders of the Pine Barrens that I needed to explore those woods of southern New Jersey for a bit before heading south for the winter. I went online and found a campsite that allowed for vehicle camping, which was perfectly situated on the Mullica River. The area had miles and miles of hiking trails. I kept a rather expensive folding mountain bike in my van and was always looking for a chance to take it out and explore. Due to the very flat land of the area, the Pine Barrens was the perfect place for that. I set up camp and was thrilled on the first night to be able to have a huge fire and enjoy the cool night air while losing myself in the dance of the flickering flames. I spent the next few days mountain biking around the wilderness, fishing the river right behind my campsite and howling back and forth with the local coyotes at night. On the 4th night, things began to get weird. The coyotes that had kept me company each prior night were nowhere to be found, and I kept hearing a loud whistling every so often in the woods around my campsite, just like a human whistle, but louder. Around midnight, I could hear somebody slowly circling me as I sat at my fire. It sounded too calculated and purposeful to be an animal. It actually sounded like a human on 2 feet, trying to be quiet as they moved through the dead and dry leaves just out of sight of the firelight. I started throwing my larger logs of firewood at them while threatening them to get away. After whoever it was walked off into the woods, I started feeling uneasy, and so I grabbed my gun out of the van and kept it in my jacket pocket. When most people think of New Jersey, they think of a densely populated cityscape or Jersey Shore beaches. But make no mistake, southern New Jersey can be as remote as parts of West Virginia. At that point, I decided that it would be best to keep my gun on me for the rest of my time out there just to be safe. The next day, I spent exploring the area on foot. I hiked for miles and came across what looked like a primitive campsite. It had 2 small shelters made from branches and twisted saplings, all weaved together. Inside one of the shelters was a few items of old torn clothing, an old non-functioning boombox, and a few faded chrome pieces of a car. The shelters were in no way weatherproof, as there was no way to keep the rain out of them, so I was very confused as to why someone would go to such elaborate lengths to build them. Both shelters had a thick bed of pine needles in them, and they smelled like skunk mixed with a barnyard. On the edge of the campsite, on all sides, were trees of all sizes that had either been pushed down or fallen over, with roots sticking out of the sandy soil. That afternoon, after a long day of exploration, I made my way back to my van, had a big meal, and went to sit on a bed of perfect moss along the edge of the river to watch the sunset. The sun was about to dip down behind the trees, and I was sitting there with my headphones on listening to music while waiting for the evening to slowly creep in. I was feeling so alive. Just then, that same skunky barnyard stench filled the air and overwhelmed me. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. Right as I began to pivot to my right to look behind me, I felt my head and body snap to my left, and what felt like a massive electric shock pass through me. I was awakened by the pain of a series of sharp tree branches scratching across the left side of my face. As I opened my eyes, I saw the ground beneath me moving, and my chin was bouncing hard off of something that was covered with coarse hair. At the same time, the world around me moved in a blurry confusion. The pain in my head was almost unbearable, and I fought to stay awake. These first few seconds were very confusing to me. I opened my eyes again and struggled to look around. But when my vision began to come into focus, I saw what looked like 2 huge, hairy legs below me moving in stride. Then suddenly I felt another, almost unbearable pain as my ankles were compressed together. As my mind cleared, I realized that a creature was carrying me over its shoulder and moving quickly through the woods. I immediately thought, am I being kidnapped by a Bigfoot? But I couldn't rationalize that at all. I was in a state of shock. I was also in pain from my head to my feet, but a huge surge of fear and adrenaline hit me, and all of a sudden I was wide awake. I was too afraid to start kicking and screaming, so I went into a mental panic as I searched for an option in my throbbing head. I rolled onto my right side and finally got a good look at what had been carrying me. It was indeed a Bigfoot. There was no doubt at what I was looking at. The Bigfoot was large and sported a full body covering of matted black hair. It was covered in leaves, pine needles, and what looked like dreadlocks. He was stumbling around trying to pull me along, and I just started beating on him and kicking with all my might. The Bigfoot turned its face to look directly at mine, like it was sending me a message. It had a mixture of pain and pure rage on his face. This kicked up my fear level to where I thought I would die from fright. But then I remembered my gun and was able to get a hand on it and pull it out. I pointed that thing right at its face. But obviously, the creature knew damn well what a gun was, and it instantly turned away, dropped me, and started to run. I could hear it crashing through the brush and the trees like a freight train as it ran off into the distance. I stayed there on my side for a moment, still pointing the gun and shaking violently. After a few seconds of total shock, I came to my senses and said out loud to myself, "What if it comes back?" I was instantly overwhelmed with panic, jumped to my feet, and sprinted as fast as I could in the opposite direction that the monster had gone. I ran for only a few hundred yards before I began to recognize where I was. It would seem that the Bigfoot had only gone a short distance with me. I was able to get to my campsite quickly and started frantically throwing everything haphazardly into my van. I was sure that this thing was going to come back for revenge at any moment. I jumped into the driver's seat, then I fired up the engine, stomped on the gas, and ripped the hell out of there. After a few miles of driving at high speed down dirt roads, I finally came out to the pavement, and only then did my fear finally begin to subside. At that same time that my heart started to slow a little bit, the pain in my head and face spiked to a horrible level. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror and realized how bloody and jacked up my face was, so I headed for the nearest hospital. When I got to the emergency room, I had not even considered what I was going to tell them had happened to me. I looked like I was hit by a bus and felt like it too. I decided to tell them that I was attacked by someone in the woods while camping. This was a bad idea as they had a police officer there within a few minutes to take a report. He could tell I was not telling the truth and told me stop holding out on him. I told him I was attacked from behind and never saw who did it. He didn't believe me, but I stuck to my story and he eventually left. Turns out I had suffered a bad concussion, a broken orbital socket, a laceration below my eyebrow requiring multiple stitches, as well as a torn eardrum in my right ear. Next day, my face swelled up so badly that my right eye was swollen shut, and my jaw hurt so badly that I couldn't chew for about a week. The whole right side of my face was one giant purple bruise. I think that the Bigfoot had smacked me hard upside the right side of my head, but I can't be sure. Needless to say, I never went camping in the Pine Barrens after that. I called my friends from the area and told them what had happened to me, and they confirmed that every so often, someone will encounter a Bigfoot-like creature in the woods around where they live. I lost my love of living in a van after the attack. I was too terrified to sleep in secluded areas or anywhere that had any kind of wooded area nearby. This severely reduced my options and made the van life too costly and difficult. I'm also not yet able to enjoy being in the woods, even if it's just a simple walk down a path with my dog. Every little noise, even just the rustle of leaves by a chipmunk, sends adrenaline surging through my veins. The lessons I learned were this: always be armed and never do anything outside with headphones on. You never know what might be creeping up behind you. I knew a woman who lived most of her life alone in an off-grid cabin in western Montana. I worked for a care company. We would come to people's homes and assist them with whatever they needed. Some clients needed daily care, while others were more independent and only needed help with the shopping and cleaning around their home. Ethel was the latter client. She was in her 80s and still sane and sound enough to live at home, but she didn't like driving much anymore. I would deliver her groceries for her and take her to appointments. She had me out to clean her house once a week, but more often than not, it was already spotless. I think she just wanted the company. Ethel was a bit of an odd bird. She was a retired art teacher and spent most of her free time painting. Her walls were completely covered with her art. She was good, don't get me wrong. In fact, she was very good. However, her preferred subject matter, especially in her last few years at home, was a little odd to say the least. Most of her paintings before she went nutty were of the Montana landscape, rivers, alpine lakes, mountains, valleys of wildflowers, that type of thing. She actually made a decent amount of money selling them at local artisan fairs and flea markets for a while. But then she started painting pictures exclusively of Bigfoot. They were good paintings too, but there isn't much of a market out there for naturalistic paintings of mythical cryptids roaming around the Montana backcountry, so she just ended up using them to decorate the walls of her cabin. As she sold more and more of her landscape pictures, the Bigfoot ones took over her home, and she became known locally as the Bigfoot Lady. I always had a good time when I visited her. She was a bit strange, I will admit, but she was kind and pleasant to be around. Many of my clients start getting a bit of dementia in their older age, and this type of thing is quite common. Sometimes when it reaches this stage, patients can get combative and difficult to interact with, but that wasn't the case with Ethel. I asked her once why she was fixated on the creature, and she said, because he lives here too. I decided not to push the subject. The following few times we talked about the creature, I just pretended I too believed it existed. Sometimes it's easier to let these people live in their delusions as long as it isn't causing harm to anyone. There was one painting in particular that caught my eye. The leaves on the trees and surrounding landscape were indicative of early autumn. The Bigfoot creature was standing tall among the trees. Its fur was two-toned. It appeared to have guard hairs like a double-coated dog or a wolf. The outside hairs were dark brown, while the shorter, seemingly undercoat hairs were white. The painting was incredibly detailed. I asked Ethel about it, about this creature's coloring, and she said that their coats changed colors with the season. They were brown during the summer and white during the winter. It helped with camouflage. She said that few people knew that about them. She said the creature known as the Yeti, or the abominable snowman. It was just a Bigfoot with its winter coat. Eventually, she had to be moved to an assisted living facility when she couldn't do as much around the house. She didn't want to leave, but I think she knew it was unrealistic for someone in her condition to be living off the grid in the wilderness. Her last 6 months in her home were strange, to say the least. She stopped painting, blaming the arthritis in her hands, but then she started creating sculptures out of natural materials. Things like tree branches, grasses, pressed flowers, pine cones. I asked her about them, and she said she didn't make them. She said Bigfoot did. She said she told the creature she would be leaving soon, and it was sad and started leaving gifts for her. I helped clean out her house and move her things to the facility. She had already been there for a few days and sent me back to her home to grab a couple of things she forgot. Before I left, she grabbed my arm and said, "And if you see my friend out there, tell him I'm okay." It took a moment for me to realize that she was talking about Bigfoot. I nodded and said yes, of course I would tell him. I knew her Bigfoot stories weren't real, but like I said before, it is easier to just agree with their stories and let them believe what they want to. Trying to convince them of reality does more harm than good in most cases. I headed out to the house. It was a 2-hour drive from Ethel's care facility, but I didn't mind. She had become a friend to me over the years, and I was happy to help her. Her house was so quiet when I got there. It hit me then that things would never be the same for Ethel, and in a way, part of her was gone. I tried not to think too much about it and started searching the house for the things she sent me here for. I wasn't there 5 minutes when I heard a knock at the door. No one else was supposed to be at the property. Maybe the realtor was coming early. I didn't know. I headed to the door to see who was there, but when I opened it, nothing. I looked around outside and didn't see any vehicles apart from my own, so I went back inside. I finished packing up a couple of boxes and loaded them into my car. I was unnerved by the strange knock at the door, but thought to myself that maybe I was just hearing things. But then, just as I was about to get into my car and drive away, I saw something in the forest behind the house. It looked like a shadow disappearing between the trees. I didn't get a good look at it, but I just knew. Ethel wasn't some crazy old woman. There was something living in the woods with her. And if I was going to believe her stories, she managed to befriend it. The creature didn't know me and didn't seem willing to show itself. I took a few steps away from my car and yelled into the forest. I was sure the creature didn't understand me, but what else was I going to do? I told it that Ethel says hello and that she's settling in well at her new home, and that she is okay. After I said that, I immediately felt like a crazy person myself, that I was probably talking to a bear or a moose or maybe even just the wind. But then it came out of the trees. Just barely. Just enough for me to see that I wasn't imagining it. It was just like her paintings. A near 6-foot-tall, two-legged ape. Its face had a human-like expression that is difficult to describe in words. You would need to see it in person. It was the fall of the year when Ethel had to move, and the creature's fur was beginning to turn white underneath. It lingered for a moment before drifting back into the shadows. I told Ethel when I got back to the facility that I had met her friend. She just smiled at me. And that was the end.